Hello everyone and welcome to this discussion about the future of stamp duty brought to you by Kensington Mortgage. I'm Declan Curry, I'm a journalist and broadcaster. I've been reporting on business, the economy and politics for very nearly 30 years now, and I'm delighted to be here as your independent moderator for this discussion. Today we're in the company of four great speakers. Allow me to introduce them to you, and as I do, they will reveal themselves to you by clicking on their web cameras. We are joined by Josie Dent from the Centre for Economics and Business Research, where she is managing economist, by Vicki Harris, who is the Chief Commercial Officer for Kensington Mortgages, by Kevin Roberts from the Legal and General Mortgage Club, where he is a director. He has nearly 30 years experience in financial services and is now responsible for one of the largest distributors of mortgages in the UK. And we're joined on the telephone by audio only by Kevin Hollinrake, who is the MP for Thirsk and Malton. So that includes the North York Moors and the coastline down at Filey. So that's a part of the country that is probably expecting a great staycation boom this year. Kevin comes from a business background. He was also a founder partner of Hunter's Estate Agents. So you're all very welcome, and thank you for joining us today to view this discussion. Many of you have submitted your questions in advance, and we'll answer as many of those as we can today as well. Over the last year, I've reported on LBC and elsewhere about a remarkable resurgence in the housing market. Despite a near 10% slump in the economic activity, we've seen house prices rise on some measurements at their fastest pace since the late 1980s. Those of us with a long memory perhaps don't relish that particular comparison. It was fueled in part by the Chancellor's temporary cut in stamp duty in England and Northern Ireland, and a reduction in similar property taxes in Scotland and Wales. It shows the power of stamp duty to influence customer behaviour and market prices. So we'll discuss if the current temporary cut should in fact be made permanent and the implications for the housing market if not. But we'll also look at some long-term questions. What is the purpose of stamp duty? Is it an effective, equitable policy lever? Is it helpful to the housing market or damaging? And if it is to be reformed or replaced, what will take its place? So let's hear from our panelists, from each of them in turn. A very quick question and a very quick answer from each of you. Should stamp duty stay or go? Vicki Harris.
It should be reformed.
Thank you. Josie Dent.
I would also say reformed.
Kevin Roberts from Legal and General.
As part of a broader reform.
That's almost a politician's answer, which teases up nicely for Kevin Hollinrake, the MP. Hello.
I would like to get rid of it completely, but it's not
Complete
clear what the solution will be to do that, to get rid of it. But I would like to abolish it completely.
Okay, thank you. We'll get into the whys and wherefores and the details of that throughout our discussion. Let's look first of all at the current impact of stamp duty on the housing market. Josie Dent from the Centre for Economics and Business Research, you've carried out some research on this recently. What did it tell us?
Thank you. Yeah, so at the end of last year, we wrote a report with Kensington Mortgages looking at the fiscal impacts of extending the current stamp duty cut. And essentially, we found that it's close to fiscally neutral or potentially even fiscally positive compared to before the cut to extend it. And we found that new tax revenues generated by higher consumption and housing market activity could potentially recoup between 58% and 104% of the direct reduction in tax revenues resulting from the stamp duty cut. And at that upper bound, that potentially leads to a fiscal surplus per year of 139 million for the government. So where does this recuperation come from? Well, we looked at 5 key channels, and just as a headline, I'll tell you the most important one, which generates 73% of that recuperation, which is kind of additional tax revenues generated by additional consumption. We call it the wealth effect as economists, from higher house prices. So people spend more because their house has gone up in value. So those are the key findings from our research, which focused on the fiscal impacts.
Okay, thank you. But your headline is that in the round, something which appears to cost the Chancellor a lot of money could actually end up earning him money.
Yes, exactly. Through the various channels, including kind of high house prices and households having more money as a result of not having to pay that stamp duty, actually there's more economic activity, which in turn generates more tax revenues for the government. And so actually, yes, as a headline, you might think that's going to raise less tax revenue, but in fact, through other channels, the government, we find, could potentially generate more tax revenue as a result of extending the holiday in its current form.
Okay, thank you. Kevin Hollinrake, just a quick thought from you. You're the MP in our panel representing Thurston Moulton, but you've got a background in this industry as well. Are you persuaded by this argument?
No, because I think, well, in business, we often used to say that people could make an argument, a department head can make an argument for investing in something or cutting something, that it would that investment would pay for itself. But you can make anything look good on a spreadsheet. And I think the reality is you've got to raise tax somehow. I think in your lead-in, Declan, you talked about what's the purpose of stamp duty. Ultimately, it's to raise money, it's to raise tax, and it does that pretty successfully. You get about 11 billion quid a year in from the stamp duty. It's easy to calculate, it's transparent, it's easy to collect, and it's difficult to avoid. So you've got to replace, I think if you're going to reform this, we're going to replace it with some other kind of taxation. 11 billion quid is a lot of money, and the government doesn't have a lot of money right now, and it's having to collect more and more from taxpayers. We've got to, I think if we're going to cut it or we're going to abolish it, whatever we're going to do, we've got to find that money directly from somewhere else. I don't think the Treasury would convince by simply cutting it and then it'll come back in by other means.
Okay, thank you. Josie Dent, you have some work still to do in terms of persuading the Treasury.
Yes, indeed. Well, yes, the lower bound suggests, you know, there could be a slight loss, but I think, you know, it's well known that it's quite a distortionary tax as well. So not even just fiscally, which is what we looked at, but there are other debates surrounding stamp duty that we might get onto that show that there are benefits in removing it in terms of real economic outcomes. So yes, you know, there's potential, and we acknowledge that in our report, for a reduction in revenues as a result of removing this tax. But what we didn't cover in the report, and perhaps we'll get a chance to discuss, are the other benefits of this current stamp duty holiday, and also, you know, the current holiday isn't a complete removal of stamp duty. We analysed a reduction in stamp duty, so yes, there would still be revenues through this tax from the situation we analysed.
Okay, thank you, Vicki Harris. The hard fact is that the temporary stamp duty holiday, all it has done is given the most enormous boost to house prices, and it's made houses and flats even more unaffordable than they were before to many first-time buyers.
I think, look, with any tax or with any change, you always have winners and losers. But I think, as Josie has talked about, you know, there's obviously the fiscal impact. There's a whole bunch of other structural problems with the housing market that a reform of the stamp duty could start to address. So whether, you know, at a time when potentially unemployment is going to rise once, you know, the Chancellor remove his furlough, you know, having more ability for people to move, geographic mobility, I think is a key structural problem with the housing market. Allowing older people to downsize. If you look at some of the, you know, smaller, older families who are making inefficient use of the housing stock, when we've got younger families with more kids who want to move to larger properties but can't. And I think, you know, we really need to look in the round. Clearly there will be winners and losers with any change. You can't get away from that, but I think you have to look at it in totality, and overall, does the economy win, and then perhaps find a way to help those who lost out as a result of it.
I hear what you're saying, Vicki, but as someone who's been reporting on this, if you ask me who are the winners, aside from estate agents, surveyors and millionaires, I can't think of many more.
Well, I think, look, the reason we've had a housing boom is not only in the past sort of year, I think is not only because of the stamp duty tax. I think there's been a huge pent up demand because of COVID, people being locked up in their houses. Interest rates are sort of at an all-time low. I think there's a bunch of reasons. I don't think you can blame everything on the stamp duty. So I think, again, we need to make a more holistic view of what's actually happening, and not just, have a snap view on, well, changing stamp duty will solve all of that.
Sure. And just to conclude, round off the thought, Vicki, of course, the Chancellor has already set out the timetable for the tapering off of the holiday and then its eventual removal later in the year. Should he stick to that? Should he make the holiday permanent?
So I think there is a case for making that holiday permanent. I think there are both the fiscal points that Josie has made. I think there are the other structural reforms to the housing market that I think it could help with. I do think there is a case for keeping it at the higher level, so above the 500,000. So the Chancellor then would obviously retain some stamp duty, and I think about half of stamp duty comes from properties that are valued at over $500,000. So I do think that there is an opportunity to reform, but not completely abolish. I think the other thing is, if he does decide he wants to go, and like he has stated, we're going to go back to where we were. I do think then there's another secondary point around how that is done. So when we originally had the end of the stamp duty freeze coming at the end of March, we saw, at the beginning of March, before the extension was announced, we saw just this huge backlog of cases and transactions that needed to go through in March. And frankly, the industry wasn't able to cope with that level of activity. We're seeing a bit, not quite as much now this month, with the end of the 500,000 moving to the 250,000 pound threshold at the end of this month. Again, we're seeing, there just aren't enough conveyancers or solicitors or removal companies to deal with it. And what that means is we might get people who just miss out, who could complete their house transaction on the the 3rd of July and miss out. So whatever the Chancellor decides ultimately to do, I do think the way in which he does it is really important as well.
Sure, but you're going to get that effect wherever he sets a date.
No, absolutely. But then I think tapering it, and I do think, given he has chosen at this point to go back to where we were, splitting that, not having a one-date cliff edge and making it two smaller cliff edges, I think was very, very sensible. And maybe even there was an opportunity to have 3 or 4 cliff edges, smaller cliff edges. But I think that's the right way to think about it. You can't do anything overnight. It just doesn't work.
Okay, thank you. Some questions from our audience. Kevin Roberts of Legal and General, I'm going to put these to you. Did the stamp duty holiday create genuine new activity, or did it just get people who were going to buy anyway to bring their plans forward? Kevin.
I think it's really hard to guess, but what it did do, it started. It was a great catalyst for a demand-led boom in terms of moving. So it was absolutely a sort of instrumental, I would have said, and possibly an intelligent thing to do at the time. But we've got more factors in play now. Vicki's mentioned some of them. You've got the low cost of money. It's very probably as cheap as it has ever been to have a mortgage. People have had a national reassessment of what they want from housing. Some of them want gardens. They can afford to live further away from home. People have lived in their homes, not just lived in their homes, if that makes sense, for a period, and it's made them readjust. We've got sort of demand from staycations on second properties, Airbnbs, buy to let. Our search criteria continue to show that demand from international buyers is there, and I think once travel restrictions ease, potential situation in Hong Kong, we will see people moving back to the UK. I think there's demand-led. Demand will return when inward migration starts again, with the opening up of travel restrictions and hospitality, etc. So we're seeing massive demand-led issues at the moment, and not a lot on supply. So when I mentioned earlier about a broader reform, I think we need to talk about that, because you've got a cyclical thing in stamp duty, but you've got some structural demand-led initiatives for the short and medium term, I think are going to continue to sort of keep heating in the market.
And Kevin Roberts, just on the specifics of the question from our audience, did you see any new activity? You've described a lot of activity, but how much of it was new?
I think we can't tell what was driven by stamp duty or not, but yeah, we saw massive activity, absolutely.
Right. And just Kevin, while you're still sort of in full flow, your thoughts on what happens to first-time buyers? We've discussed it a little bit already, but the question from the audience is, what happens to first-time buyers who are now in a worse position than they were before the pandemic?
I think that's why we have to address the supply side. I don't think whatever happens with taxation, and that's for the Treasury to decide, and I don't think we necessarily can be drawn there, but we have to tackle supply side issues as well, because of people like first time buyers, all those people that cannot afford to get onto the ladder at the moment, particularly in London and the Southeast, where affordability is one of the major factors impacting them at the moment. There's almost a divide, not north-south, but you've got jobs and economic prosperity perhaps in the south, but you've got a housing issue there around affordability potentially. And at the north, where housing is more affordable, you perhaps don't have the jobs, etc. So we support the levelling up and building back better agenda as well.
And Kevin Roberts, do you think the temporary holiday should become permanent?
I don't think we need any more demand stimulus at the moment, so not at the moment, no.
Kevin Hollinrake, representing Thurston Moulton and with a background in the industry as well. You heard what Kevin Roberts said about the importance of levelling up, about the regional disparities in house prices and demand. I'm sure there's been huge demand for people who want a view of the North York moors or the bit of coastline that might just be taken from you and given to the neighbouring constituency in the boundary review, but that's for another matter. How is it looking to you?
Yes, thanks for the plug for my constituency and the staycations. And I've not lost any of the North York moors or Filey. I'm very pleased to say so far anyway. I mean, I think Kevin's absolutely right that this is principally a supply issue, an issue in the housing market. But I just don't think we can ever get that back in balance, actually. There's just such a shortage of land because of a very restrictive planning system, which is there for good reason too. You're never going to catch up in terms of the supply meeting the demand. And so if we think we're just going to build lots of houses and therefore prices are going to fall, which is going to solve the problem for first-time buyers, well, I promise you that's not going to be very popular in a town hall if an MP is addressing a load of constituents and saying that's going to be my strategy for solving this problem in the Surrey, for example. You probably get a fair bit of criticism. So I think we've got to look at other mechanisms to try and help first-time buyers, which is the principal problem here. If you're on the housing ladder, you can it's easy to scale up. It's very difficult to get onto the ladder in the first place, and that's the same in place like North Yorkshire as it is in parts of London and the South East, which is the biggest problem. So I think the way we're going to have to try and deal with that is through some more artificial mechanisms. The government stepped in again, of course, in terms of a mortgage guarantee, so it's getting more first-time buyers on 95% mortgages. So the principal problem for first-time buyers is raising the deposit, which is tied to the stamp duty issue as well, of course. So that will help to get some people onto the housing ladder. The other thing, which I think is a very good policy, and I did advocate this, so I'm a little bit biased, I guess, is something called first homes that the government's come up with, which is properties being sold at a discount, an in perpetuity discount. So first-time buyers can buy a home at up to half price, and key workers, whatever else, and when you come to sell that property, you sell it at half price too. So I think that is a way to really address the affordability issue and to allow many more people on lower incomes to get onto the housing ladder.
And council house building as well, of course. It's time for that to come back, isn't it?
Massively. I mean, not just councils, housing associations. I agree. I think we should invest more in affordable housing of all types, to rent, shared ownership, and to purchase. I mean, the scale of the challenge, when you look at London and the South East, the average house price to earnings ratio, which is what Kevin mentioned earlier, it's about 11 or 12 times in parts of London and the South East. I mean, even if prices drop by 20%, which I say wouldn't be very popular with lots of people in. Sorry, my microphone dropped out. People in London and the South East, but even if it dropped by 20%, they're still going to be very unaffordable. So we need to build all kind of manner of housing, all different types of housing, to rent, to purchase, shared ownership. Really, my plea would be we don't build some of the sink estates we've built in the past. We need to do this in a much more rounded way, so a mixture of full market price and discounted and affordable and truly affordable social housing. So, yeah, and that does mean more investment by the taxpayer, but it will mean longer term payback in a reduction of housing benefit.
Okay, thank you. We'll give you a moment to plug your microphone back in as well. Vicki Harris of Kensington Mortgages, you said that longer term, we need to look at the reform of stamp duty. Set out the case for that. What would that look like?
So, look, I don't have the answers of exactly what it should be, but I do think we need to think about some of the structural problems with the housing sector and try to come up with a solution. And as I said before, there will be winners and there'll be losers, as happens anytime you change policy. And I think we then need to look at who the potential losers are, and if it's first-time buyers, some of the solutions that some of the other panel members have talked about might be the answer. But I do think we need to address geographic mobility, particularly at a time when we, over the next 2 or 3 years coming out of the pandemic, we're presumably going to be wanting to stimulate the economy, and people may need to, may want to move geographically to find employment in other parts of the country. I think we have a massive problem where, older people aren't downsizing, and so we have very inefficient use of the housing stock. I think, if we can find a solution that encourages people to move in order to solve some of those problems, but also helps the people who suffer as a result of that, then I think that's what the answer needs to be. And I don't have the answers. If I had the answers, then maybe I'd be sitting in the Chancellor's shoes, and it's not easy. But I do think we need to sort of stand back and look at it, because I think irrespective of COVID and what's happened in the past 12 months, I think there were structural problems even before we went into this pandemic.
Josie Dent, what are your thoughts on this in terms of the issues that should be addressed? Some of the discussion we've had already about affordability, reform or replacement of stamp duty. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that stamp duty is a very simple and effective tax, because you're taxing people when they have a lot of cash, when they have money for their deposit. And so it does have benefits in that sense, in that it's a good way to collect tax revenue. But yeah, as Vicki just mentioned, there are several distortions it causes, and there are possibly better taxes that cause fewer distortions. Taxing wealth is very, very difficult. And so there are kind of 2 key ways to do that, perhaps like stamp duty and inheritance tax are 2 of the main ways. But stamp duty creates, as Vicki said, downsizing issues. People who might downsize can't afford to because they have to pay the stamp duty, and then see very few benefits from that funding. So perhaps relief for downsizing from stamp duty would be an option. And then also, yes, the labour market distortions from people not being willing to move because they'd have to pay stamp duty do create issues. So perhaps, yes, extending the stamp duty holidays, we've shown could potentially be fiscally neutral, benefits the lower end of the market in terms of not having to pay stamp duty, but you could keep it on higher value properties where it still would raise a lot of revenue.
I've heard this argument before that stamp duty prevents people moving to get a job. Is there any evidence that it actually happens?
We didn't look specifically at that for our report, but yes, I do believe that there is evidence. It adds a cost to moving. Obviously, there are other costs. People often decorate a lot when they move home, and other fixed moving costs, lawyers' fees. They're all there, but it does add an additional cost that potentially, makes the difference between moving for the job and not moving for the job. And so just removing that would create more flexibility.
Okay, Kevin Roberts of Legal and General, the case for reform, what is it?
I think Vicki made some useful points about utilisation of the housing stock, and Kevin, it's not just a demand, it's not just a supply, it's a utilisation. We seem to have homes that maybe older people in that are not utilising the space. We may have homes where the jobs aren't, or jobs where the homes aren't, etc. So it's a matter for all sorts of things. And I think just by focusing on one tax, i.e. stamp duty, is probably not the answer. We've got the opportunity to sit back now, or the Treasury has, so the opportunity to sit back now and reevaluate and make sure that that they take their time to think, well, how are we going to raise the revenue that absolutely that they need, without any of the unintended consequences that come with just sort of pulling a lever on one specific thing. So I don't know whether it's a reform of stamp duty. I think we've got to take time to look back and look at the whole gambit ranges of things. Why is it that we have a housing issue in the UK?
Okay, Kevin, Hollinrake, of course, the political challenge is that if you abolish something and you think they should be abolished, there is always pressure to replace it with something, and sometimes the replacement is more politically damaging than the hated thing you are getting rid of. And one immediately thinks of the community charge in that context, replacing the rates. Kevin Hollinrake, are you still with us, or have we lost the connection to you? He's gone. That's a.
I'm here, Declan. Sorry. Did you get my question, or do you need me to? I did. I got your question perfectly well. Yes, Ronald Reagan once said, didn't he, that so there are simple answers, but there are no easy answers. And I think, and there's no doubt, stamp duty is not a desirable tax. It's a tax on transactions which is bound to inhibit activity. And we know the housing market is responsible for lots of other parts of the economy in terms of money that's spent following housing transactions. So it's far from ideal, but we do have other taxes on transactions, VAT, for example. So you can make the case for it, but certainly it must inhibit some transactions. I mean, the stamp duty holiday, the exemption that the Chancellor's put together will cost the Treasury between 4 and 5 billion quid. Josie may be right; they may come back through other ways, but it's always a difficult one to get the Treasury persuaded by those arguments. And there is one solution that, I mean, ideally you would scrap it completely, as I said right at the start. One of the things that a number of people are talking about, which I think was first proposed by someone like Adam Smith a long time ago, is some kind of tax, either a tax on land, general land value tax, or a proportional property tax, which instead of having council tax, which is based upon values from 1971 or something, it's based on the actual value of somebody's home. And you could do that in a way that completely scraps stamp duty, and you just pay a larger, for most people you pay a lower amount in terms of council than council tax is today. But of course, if you're an expensive home, particularly in London South East, you'll pay a fair bit more, but you'd have no stamp duty when you move. So that's one to look out for, but again, politically very, very challenging. But so we could definitely do something that completely gets rid of it, but I'm not sure everybody would be attracted by the alternative.
Sure, and I don't want to kill off an interesting discussion about what might replace it by then throwing 100 different objections to each particular suggestion. That's not going to get us anywhere. But when you talk about a tax, a property tax of the like that you describe, doesn't that then include in it some of the things that made people dislike the rate so much, that you have elderly widows, elderly widowers on their own in a big house with a huge bill, even though they're only using the services that are provided for one individual?
Yes, that's true. It's a valid argument, and I mean, there are ways to mitigate that, capitalising the charge to a point where the house is sold or the person passes away. But there's no doubt, there's where you create some winners, and you could create some winners by having a proportional property tax. You're also going to create some losers. The vast majority of people win, of course, because council tax is pretty regressive. So, in terms of a proportion of people's wealth or income or property values, it's much higher in the north than it is in London, the southeast. But nevertheless, so you create some winners in the north, but you create a fair few losers in London, the southeast by doing that. And some of the different cohorts of people, as you suggest, would be potentially quite badly affected.
Not to be entirely flippant, but a charge on a property after somebody passes on, isn't that what inheritance tax is meant to do?
Well, obviously that can be paid as ongoing. If somebody wants, it is a charge, it's a replacement for council tax. There's a valid argument for it. I mean, council tax is based upon the value of somebody's home, of course. It's just not very directly linked to it, and it's become quite anachronistic in terms of its current levels. But I mean, there are examples of other kind of property value-based tax, which that would be. Business rates, for example, has a direct correlation between the current value of a property, a commercial property. So this isn't, and proportional property taxes are in effect in different parts of the world, Australia and the US, for example. So I think we should have the debate. I'm not saying any solution that's been proposed so far is the perfect solution, but we know that stamp duty and other taxes are imperfect. Council tax is imperfect, stamp duty is imperfect. We moved from a slab-based stamp duty system, of course, back in 2014, because we all complained about that then, about these distortions at 250,000 or 500,000 where you paid a huge amount more. And so as agents, we were pricing things below or above certain thresholds, and moved to a slice system, which on the face of it looks fairer, but it really hits people very hard as you get into the higher values. And of course, you could argue those people can afford it, but lots of complaints again in London and the South East about that really preventing many transactions.
Sure. Is there an argument here, Kevin, then for a taxation that recognises these regional disparities? Is there a regional tax rather than a national tax that should be eliminated?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the reality is if you looked at proportional property tax, and people have pitched this at different levels, 0.2% of value or 0.48% of value, there's the kind of range. So I can imagine people in your audience now getting the calculators out and seeing how much it would be on their particular properties for those kind of levels. But if you did it on a national basis like that, you had one simple figure, it would take into account the regions. It would take into account that properties are much cheaper in Teesside, for example, than they are in Surrey. So and you can argue there's lots more wealth in Surrey than there is in Teesside. It's a way to level up the system, but there are clearly counter arguments, and I think what we need is a proper. If we're going to do this, I don't think we can kind of fiddle with it. I don't think we just simply make some tweaks here and resolve the problem we're talking about. If you are going to replace stamp duty completely or completely reform the system, it's going to be painful in some areas, and some people are going to benefit and some people are going to lose out.
Does it need something like a Royal Commission?
Yeah, I mean, the trouble with the Royal Commissions is, what we've looked at in the past in things like social care, is they come back, when they're presented back to Parliament, members of Parliament then throw up their hands in horror thinking, how the hell am I going to sell that to my constituents? And that's always going to be different depending on how that affects your particular constituencies. So I personally think we should have a proper debate in Parliament, maybe a parliamentary commission based upon cross-party MPs from either side of the House and peers to look at this through a political lens as well as through an economic lens and try and suggest some solutions.
Okay, thank you. You've given us very full and detailed answers, and very much in the spirit of the discussion of sort of testing to see what might or might work in a theoretical concept. So thank you for your time with us. Josie Dent, what struck me most of all about that particular exchange is that any idea comes back to a tax on property, and it has to be that, doesn't it? Because that's where the wealth of the nation is locked up.
Indeed, that's a good point. I think increasing council tax puts a tax on people when they don't necessarily have loads of cash in hand. So yes, it could potentially significantly disadvantage people who have accumulated a lot of housing wealth, especially if they've owned their house for 20, 30 years, and they might not have high incomes, but they've got a vast amount of housing wealth. And so charging them every year could potentially be very difficult for those people. But it is, yes, a very viable alternative. I mean, in terms of alternatives to stamp duty, of course, our report showed that you don't necessarily need to replace it with anything. But if we accept that there might be a slight loss of revenue to the government as a result of extending this holiday or removing stamp duty completely, you're right that a lot of the UK's wealth is held up in housing, but I think I would rather see a raise in inheritance tax, again, taxing people when they have cash in hand. You know, a lot of people receive inheritance nowadays in their 50s, and they've probably by that point built up a significant amount of their own wealth. And so charging them a higher rate of inheritance tax has the benefit of, yes, taxing them when they have cash in hand, when potentially they're selling their home that they've inherited, and also has other benefits in terms of inequality. you could tax inheritance at a higher rate and then put that money that you've received from the wealthier households in the UK into a fund to help less wealthy households in the UK, and it would go a long way to improving inequality. So I think in terms of wealth taxes, I'd rather see inheritance tax than stamp duty.
Sure, provided it's not all being gobbled up with social care costs before the final moment arrives, of course. But Josie, the political movement over the political direction of travel over the last decade or so, certainly since George Osborne, has been to lift more and more people out of inheritance tax. Again, when we look at what the Treasury might be persuaded to do, are they really going to be in the market for something that more people paying higher inheritance tax? I'm not convinced.
I mean, every tax is going to be unpopular because you're taking money from people. I'm not saying tax at 100%. I'm sure that would be ineffective because at that point people would just try and avoid it. But reform to try and make it more effective, and also just changing the culture around tax, saying, yes, I've earned this money and it's an honour to contribute it to the government. That might be a more difficult thing to do, but raising it slightly and saying, well done to the people who do pay tax, rather than people trying to avoid it at all costs, would definitely benefit. I mean, that's a trickier thing to do, but yes, raising it slightly and making people proud to pay tax to their government, I think could potentially be a very effective way of raising more revenue.
Okay, thank you. Kevin Roberts, we've not heard from you in a while. In terms of all that we've discussed in the last 10 minutes or so about things that might work, things that might not work, we are still looking at raising money through property. However, it's the same cake that we're slicing. We're just choosing to slice it in a different way.
I agree. My knowledge is based on sort of mortgages and housing rather than tax. So I'm going to let my fellow panelists talk in more detail on that. But you're right. The government has a job.
But just in terms of acknowledging what you say about where your specialism is, that helps inform the debate, though, because you are then able to tell us about those regional differences that Kevin Hollinrake referred to, and maybe a one-size national policy is no longer the right fit. What do you think?
It's clear as Legal in General, we've recently launched a Rebuilding Britain index that we're going to try and look at how we're managing that levelling up. And it's clear from our first wave of research that housing is an issue in the London and South East, especially around affordability, but less so in the north, where jobs and basic economic prosperity is. So I don't think it's as simple as sort of one tax or this, that, and the other. I think we fully support sort of a much more balanced UK, and that has to benefit on a whole host of stuff. Least of all, housing and the unaffordability of housing in London and the South East. So there's a range of initiatives, and just picking on one specific tax is not necessarily the lever to pull, but we do need to think about it. And we're proud of the tax take of this industry that it generates from that for the government, and proud to work in the mortgage industry where, and as financial services, which contribute a huge deal to the exchequer.
Do you think it's overtaxed?
I don't know whether it's overtaxed. I would suggest that all the demand that I spoke about earlier suggests that it is not overtaxed, is it? Because people still want to move house, and there's many reasons for wanting to move house and invest in property in the UK. So I don't think we can say that, Declan.
Vicki Harris, stamp duty or whatever replaces it, or whatever we call it, what should its purpose be? What's the point of it?
So I think it has a number of purposes, and perhaps that's why it's so difficult to come up with one single solution, and that's what we're struggling with here is but on the one hand, the government needs to raise money to pay for public services, and we all get that, but on the other hand, I think in whatever form they do that, we need to make sure, and we need to have the debate as a country to ensure that minimizes any distortions that it creates as a result of it, to ensure that we stimulate sufficient economic activity to ensure that other taxes generate the wealth for the country that's needed, and to ensure that we don't leave pockets of the population behind, as in the first-time buyers that we've talked about now. So I think part of the problem and what we're struggling with here is that there are a number of different things that we're trying to solve all at the same time, and there is no perfect solution at all. I do think coming out of the pandemic, we have an opportunity to stand back and rethink it. And exactly as Kevin said, I think the government should take its time and really sort of think through that and come up with the best solution that we can. But there will be no perfect solution. I don't think we should kid ourselves that there is a perfect solution, and there will be winners and losers, and there will be unintended consequences. But I do think we've identified enough problems with the current system that it is the right time now to stand back and look and see if we can do something better.
And we're having this discussion today, Vicki. Do you think that there is an appetite for, is there an overwhelming demand within the industry itself for change? And is there an appetite among those who might make that change happen to do it?
Yeah, so I can't speak for the Treasury. The Treasury has an awful lot on its plate at the moment, and frankly, stamp duty is probably one of the smaller tax generators. So maybe it's not that high up on their list unless they believe that solving some of the unintended consequences would have a much bigger impact for some of the issues that they need to solve. So can't speak for the government, although I'm sure they must have looked at it. The very fact that they extended it in March means that they have looked at it and must be thinking about it to some extent. I think the industry does feel that some of these structural reforms really do need to get solved, and the industry therefore would be, I'm sure, very willing to help and provide data and support to the government and the Treasury as they try to think that through.
Now we have a few more audience questions, and we've sort of touched on these topics already, but let me, Vicki, put the question to you, and we'll add a little bit more detail if we feel it's appropriate. Would a review of stamp duty and capital gains tax, abolishing purchase tax and introducing a reformed sales tax on all transactions be a fairer system for all? We've sort of talked our way around that one already. Were you convinced by the arguments that might be something that's worth considering?
Look, I think all options are worth considering right now. I think as we've demonstrated over the past sort of 40 minutes, there are lots of ideas out there. I think we need to stand back and look at all of them and work out which has the fewest unintended consequences, and which ones meet the needs of the government right now. Because frankly, what the government needs now may not be what the government needs in 5 years' time. So we might need something now that then changes again, who knows.
Sure. Another audience observation, and again it's reflecting discussions that we've already had among the five of us. Could there be an incentive for empty nesters to downsize and potentially not pay stamp duty on their onward purchase, maybe a threshold similar to that for first-time buyers? Kevin Roberts, just bringing you in on this. We have discussed first-time buyers, we have discussed empty nesters as well. Do we talk about empty nesters enough? Do we give enough attention to the particular issues that they face in the housing market?
No, I don't think that I don't see the utilisation of the UK's housing stock talked about a great deal, if I'm honest. You've got demand factors, you've got supply, and you've got utilisation. Those are the three things that have to be looked at in the round. And maybe COVID has changed people's perceptions on whether they want to downsize or they're quite happy living in a large house and that kind of stuff. So it'd be interesting what's happened there. But ultimately, if you are empty nesters or you're looking, what are the options? Retirement villages, that kind of stuff. We're not great in the UK at developing different kinds of housing that people in the future may want, and I think that's something for us to think about as well, in terms of how do we create the housing stock and the properties that people actually want to buy and will need going forward. So I think it's a really important topic that we should be discussing more.
And Kevin Roberts, just staying with that, we have seen in terms of population changes in demographics over the last 10 or 15 years. We've seen that as people get older, there is a sort of a recurring demand for, not for family homes, but for either single living or living as new couples, as people get remarried as they get older. I'm sure I read somewhere recently that the biggest increase in remarriage, certainly before the pandemic, was among the over 80s as a consequence of the longer lifespan that we now face. Cebr, obviously, you think that we perhaps aren't building the right types of houses to keep up with how society is changing.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's my previous point. We really need to think now in terms of what are we building. You know, there's a big focus on starter homes, family homes, but you know, how are we building properties and improving and changing our housing stock to look after the varying needs as people as we all are getting older, and the demographics point us in that direction. So yeah, demand, supply, utilization. If we can have you know, proper thoughts and debates around all of those, I think we can move the agenda forward.
Kevin Hollinrake, I imagine that or the elected representatives of the people spend rather more time thinking about older empty nesters because, well, older people vote.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's much more likely, I think, that the Treasury would step in and develop policies like that, which are tweaks around the edges of the system, than radically reform it. I mean, Bill Shankly, when he used to send his players out on the pitch, before he would say, listen, the score's 0-0, don't let it get any worse. And that's the kind of Treasury attitude, really, which I completely understand. It's easy for us to pontificate, to talk about, oh, we should do this, we should do that. But as has been mentioned before, you know, the law of unintended consequences is the one we revisit more often than not in Parliament. So I think it's more likely that we'd see a series of interventions, as we see now, of course, and lots of interventions we're talking about now. With this, you know, the exemption, the raising of the lower limit for stamp duty to 500,000 is an intervention to try and tackle a short-term problem, and that's how we tend to look at things. But ultimately, housing market in the UK is pretty dysfunctional, but it's not likely to get any better very easily. You've got a very restrictive planning system, scarcity of land, you've got very low interest rates, you've got history of high price growth, so it encourages speculation. So it's not likely that anything, so that's the reason why property taxes are so high in the UK, and they're very high in the UK compared to lots of other countries. But that's to really try and extract some of that wealth and get it back into public services or into other people's hands on lower incomes or without the wealth. So it's a series of this, you know, lots and lots of interventions to try and make the system fairer. And I think the Treasury is likely, or any Treasury, not just this Treasury, any Treasury is likely to pursue those kind of interventions rather than something really radical like complete abolition of stamp duty.
Okay, thank you. Vicki Harris, we've mentioned a couple of times about the capacity of the industry and the choke points in the industry that cause distortions. Looking first of all at what's going to happen after September if the Chancellor sticks to his timetable, what do you see for phasing out of the stamp duty holiday in England and Northern Ireland? What do you see the impact on the industry at that point?
So look, I do think we'll get a bit of a choke point around the end of September. We're going to probably want a bit at the end of this month. I think there was an article, was it Rightmove or Zoopla, were stated, I think it was in the Sunday Times this weekend, around 50,000 people at risk of missing this deadline. We'll have more people, I suspect, at risk of missing the next deadline because it's the threshold is lower and closer to the average house value. Once that has happened, though, you know, and we probably go back to a lower level of activity in the housing industry, you know, the industry, you know, hopefully should be able to cope well with that. I think one thing we are seeing more and more of, and I think that is long overdue, is more technology, use of technology in the industry. You know, the way in which, you know, solicitors fax documents and money is maybe paid through checks, and you know, it's one of the, we always say at Kensington, you know, it's one of the few parts of sort of retail banking that is still living in the dark ages in terms of how it uses technology, and there are a number of new companies out there that are looking at creating platforms and new types of technology to simplify and streamline that process, which I think I think that's one of the other problems with the industry is just the stress factor of buying and selling a house is enormous, because there's so much paperwork and so many different parties involved, whether it's the conveyancer or the solicitor or the estate agent or the mortgage provider or the mortgage broker. And, you know, no one, you know, at certain points in the process, no one knows where anyone else is. And I think there's a big opportunity for technology to help solve some of that, and just to simplify and streamline some of the processes. So I think we are seeing more of that, and certainly we at Kensington are investing in that, and we see a lot of our competitors investing in it, and also some, you know, Kevin, a lot of the broker and advice industry is also investing a lot in that, and I think that's really important going forward, and that actually on its own could help just make things a bit more simple for buyers and sellers.
Kevin Roberts, what are brokers expecting after September?
A holiday, I think. So I mean, the industry has coped really well, and you know, the hours that people are putting in, we can't sort of go without sort of saying a big thank you to people, both at lenders and advisors, as well as conveyancers and removal companies. This demand has created, you know, the unintended consequence of huge work, but you know, that's great. I think we're in for a soft landing, though. I do think if we're in a plane, you know, we started our descent, you know, following sort of the peaks in March, and we'll go down. But when we land, we're still going to be on or about sort of plan levels or pre-pandemic levels. There's so much, you know, I won't go on about the demand-led sort of stimulus there, but there's real demand for people to move house. This year we've got over 700,000 remortgages of people coming off 2-year and 5-year fixed rates alone. So there's plenty for this industry to do, and to make sure that we continue to look after customers and consumers really well. So yeah, hopefully some of the pressure will come out, and so some of our people can have a holiday. So I think that's what we're most looking forward to.
And Vicki's point about the better use of technology, emerging technologies coming from fintech or wherever else, does that fill you with a great sort of hope for the white heat of technology transforming things?
Yeah, I completely. I think what we saw during the pandemic was a shift to technology, but we probably just use replacement technologies. You know, where we would go face to face, we use Zoom. What we now need to do, and what is starting, is transformative change and new things coming to market, and that's what our consumers are demanding. You know, if we are in the dark ages still, as Vicki suggests, we can't stay there. Consumers will find something different, and some way different, or bigger competitors or new competitors will do that. So we have to transform as an industry, and I'm really excited that we've got real opportunities to do that, not just in mortgages, but across the housing journey. I think there's more to come here.
And Vicki, this is relevant to our discussion on stamp duty, because of course, if there is going to be a big change, it's something that the industry needs to have a capacity for adaptation. And, you know, like most industries, it's had an enormous amount of change already in a very, very short period of time over the course of the last year. Is there a limit to how much future change can be absorbed?
Look, I think you know, Kevin mentioned that, you know, a lot of meetings have taken place over Zoom, and that has been probably, you know, what I've observed, that's probably been the biggest use of technology for change in the past 12 months. I think what the industry now needs is some of the sort of long, convoluted processes that people have to go through to transact on a house, actually to make that less paper-based and more based on technology. And I think absolutely the industry can absorb that. The industry has been talking about it for a long time, and for the first time, I think now we're actually starting to see it happen. And you know, absolutely the industry can absorb that, and wants it, and is waiting for it, and I think we'll embrace it. Yeah.
Kevin Hollinrake, encouraging you to just swap your hat for a moment and cast your mind back to your days in business before politics. Is this something that you would be arguing for now if you were in that position?
Well, yes, but I'm less optimistic than some of the other people who've spoken on this, really, than Kevin and Vicki. I think it's, I mean, the transactional nature of the housing market is sclerotic. I mean, we used to, in the old days, we used to exchange on a third of our pipeline, our sole subject contract stock every month, and today it's about half that. I mean, it's because of numerous different checks and rules on mortgage checks and capacity within the conveyancing sector, lots of things. It really is a very frustrating process, which again is a brake on the economy, and it's a cost involved for all the participants. So, but it doesn't seem to be any immediate solutions how we do it. Of course, fintech could play a part, but doesn't strike me actually getting the money from one place to another is the biggest problem we've got. It's really about lots of other checks and balances that happen through the process, and capacity and expertise within particularly in the conveyancing sector, I think, is one of the biggest issues. I'm not sure how you immediately resolve that without reduction in housing transactions. And because of conveyancing has been commoditized in terms of costs, it doesn't really, if you see a reduction in transactions, you probably see reductions in the number of conveyancers. So there are some real problems, structural problems within the logistical, just in the logistics of the housing market in terms of trying to speed up transactions. But we should all work to that end. But I haven't seen any immediate solutions to that at this point in time. I know people have been working on it for years and years, decades, in fact, but not really come to any real movement forward on that, despite all that work.
Vicki, this may need to be the subject of a standalone panel discussion at some point in the future. Let me bring Josie Dent in just on as sort of to augment the discussion about what might happen in the industry after September when the temporary stamp duty holiday is phased out. Do we have any numbers on what might happen to house prices after that point?
I don't actually have our forecast to hand, but I think there are a number of factors at play here. And so, yes, we have the end of the stamp duty holiday, which can potentially reduce demand. But we also have the end of furlough, and we're expecting unemployment to rise to around 5.5%, which is nowhere near as high as we originally thought unemployment could get at the start of the pandemic. So it shows how well government support has performed. But yet a rise in unemployment also can have knock-on impacts on the housing market. And so those two factors together could potentially reduce demand for housing and potentially slow house price growth. On the other hand, there's been an awful lot of talk about what people are doing with their savings that they've built up. Not everyone has been able to save, but hundreds of billions have been accumulated by many households who have kept their jobs through the pandemic. And I think a lot of that, people who've been able to start saving and potentially want to continue to save, have realised that maybe buying a house is an achievable goal for them now. They can get the money for a deposit. And those kind of factors increasing demand actually could continue even after the end of the stamp duty holiday and the end of furlough. So I think, the decline in house prices again is nowhere near as dramatic as we first thought it might be at the beginning of the pandemic, because government support has performed so well in terms of sustaining demand.
Okay, thank you. Kevin Hollinrake, we've just a minute or so left in our discussion. Where does this discussion on stamp duty and the future of stamp duty go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the industry should continue to engage with parliamentarians, and we should have discussion in Parliament. And there will be lots of different people who have similar views to different views been expressed on the panel. I think ultimately the Treasury's got to decide. This Treasury will decide whether it sees the 4 or 5 billion pounds it's cost for this raising of the threshold of stamp duty, whether it can afford to do that on an annual basis, and whether it thinks it can get that back in the future. I think it won't say that. I think it'll phase it back in like it said it will do, and then there'll be a discussion within the Treasury about how we reform stamp duty. I just don't see it changing dramatically. I don't think there's a political appetite for it, and I think it would be seen as a very risky move to do something very transformational or something very revolutionary. But I think ultimately it will have to be a political decision which way to go.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much to all of our contributors. It's now 11 o'clock. We know how heavily scheduled people's Zoom calls are nowadays, back to back. So you will join me, I know, in thanking Josie Dent, Vicki Harris, Kevin Hollinrake and Kevin Roberts. That concludes our discussion on the future of stamp duty, organised by Kensington Mortgages. I'm Declan Curry. Thank you very much for your company and your attention, and thank you for all your questions as well. Goodbye.